The year is 1431, and the world's largest city has become a ghost town, where bustling markets once thrived and ornate temples echoed with prayers. Now only silence remains. This is Angkor, the crown jewel of the Khmer Empire, and in just a few short decades, it transformed from humanity's greatest urban achievement into an abandoned ruin swallowed by jungle vines. The question that haunts archaeologists and historians isn't just how such a massive civilization could vanish, but why absolutely no one saw it coming. What we've uncovered about their final years will completely change how you think about the rise and fall of civilizations. But before we dive into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please introduce yourself in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're on to building a global community here. Thank you once more for joining me today, so without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The Dragon and the Mountain. Before we speak of temples or kings, we must understand water. The story of the Khmer Empire begins not with conquest or ceremony, but with geography. In the heart of Southeast Asia lies the Tonle Sap, a lake that breathes. During the monsoon months, the Mekong River swells with such force that it reverses the flow of the Tonle Sap River, pushing water backward into the lake. The lake doubles, sometimes triples in size. Fish migrate inward by the millions. When the dry season returns, the waters recede, leaving behind rich sediment across the floodplains. This is the rhythm that made civilization possible. To the north of this breathing lake rise the Kulin Hills, sandstone mountains covered in forest, cut by rivers that flow year-round. These hills would become sacred. The stone beneath them would build an empire. According to the inscriptions, a Brahmin priest named Kondinya arrived by sea, carrying a sacred bow. He met Soma, daughter of the Naga king who ruled the waters. They married. The Naga drank the waters that covered the land, giving it to his daughter as a dowry. From this union came the Khmer people, born from the meeting of Indian priestly knowledge and the serpent spirits of Southeast Asian water. This origin story is not mere myth. It encodes a founding principle. The Khmer rulers understood themselves as mediators between the cosmic order of the Hindu gods and the natural power of water serpents, the Nagas who controlled rain and rivers. From the beginning, their legitimacy rested on managing water. The challenge was immense. The monsoons brought floods that could destroy. The dry season brought heat that could parch. Building a paradise for god-kings in this landscape meant mastering seasonal violence. It meant reading the land not as an obstacle but as a system that could be re-engineered. The Kulin Hills provided more than stone and water. They offered elevation in a flat, flood-prone region. Around 802 CE, Jayavarman II performed a ritual on Phnom Kulin that declared him a Chakravartin, a universal monarch, no longer subordinate to the Javanese kings to the south. This was the symbolic birth of Angkorian kingship. The location mattered. Mountains in Hindu cosmology represent Mount Meru, the center of the universe, home of the gods. By claiming the Kulin Hills, Jayavarman II claimed cosmic authority. His successors would spend centuries building that authority in stone. The empire that emerged from this founding moment was never simply a kingdom. It was an ideology made landscape. Every temple mountain would echo Mount Meru. Every reservoir would echo the cosmic oceans. The rulers who followed understood that controlling water meant controlling rice, and rice meant power. They looked at the Tonle Sap's seasonal floods and saw not chaos, but potential. They looked at the Kulin Hills and saw not wilderness, but the physical form of heaven. The early Angkorian period saw capital cities shift across the landscape. Jayavarman II himself moved his court several times, experimenting with different sites before his successors settled the capital at Yashodharapura, what we now call Angkor. Each move reflected ongoing calculations about water access, defensibility, and symbolic geography. Indravarman I, ruling in the late 9th century, built the first major reservoir, the Indra Tataka, and established a pattern his successors would follow. Each king must build a temple mountain for his state deity and a barre to demonstrate his control over water and prosperity. This pattern reveals something essential about Khmer kingship. The king was not simply a political ruler. He was the earthly representative of the gods, responsible for cosmic order manifesting as worldly abundance. When the rains came on time and the harvests thrived, this proved the king's legitimacy. When droughts struck or floods devastated crops, this suggested the king had lost divine favor. The pressure on each ruler was immense. You couldn't simply govern competently. You had to demonstrate cosmic approval through increasingly elaborate building projects. The religion itself blended traditions. Hindu deities, particularly Vishnu and Shiva, dominated official worship. But these gods merged with local animist beliefs in spirits inhabiting natural features like mountains, rivers, and trees. The Nagas remained central, appearing in temple architecture as protective serpents flanking causeways and balustrades. Chinese accounts from the 3rd century describe Funan, the predecessor state to the Khmer Empire, as a place where Hindu practices coexisted with indigenous traditions. This syncretism strengthened rather than weakened the system. It allowed local populations to see their traditional beliefs incorporated into the grand cosmological framework the god kings constructed. The agricultural base made everything possible. Rice cultivation in Southeast Asia required different techniques than in India or China. The Tonle Sap's annual flood provided natural irrigation, but the Khmer went further. They built canals to extend the flood's reach. They constructed embankments to protect fields from excessive flooding. They dug ponds near homes to capture rainwater for dry season use. Archaeological surveys reveal these household ponds across the entire urban area, suggesting a culture deeply attuned to water management at every scale, from the individual family to the imperial administration. What they built next would become the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. But first, they needed a king ambitious enough to attempt the impossible. That king would come to power in the early 12th century, and his monument would become the most recognizable temple complex in the world. Angkor Wat would represent the culmination of 3 centuries of architectural and hydraulic experimentation. It would also represent a peak from which the only direction was decline, though no one at the time could see what was coming. The God King's blueprint, Suryavarman II and Angkor Wat. Suryavarman II took the throne around 1113 CE through violence. The inscriptions are tactful, describing divine favor and legitimate succession, but the evidence suggests he removed his predecessor, Dharanendravarman I, through force. The transition left scars. Some provincial governors refused to acknowledge the new king's authority immediately. Suryavarman spent his early years consolidating power, putting down rebellions, and reasserting central control over distant territories. Once secure, he turned his gaze outward and upward toward military campaigns that would extend Khmer influence, upward toward a temple that would cement his legacy for eternity. His military ambitions were considerable. He launched multiple campaigns into the Dai Viet kingdoms to the east, though these largely failed to produce lasting territorial gains. He attacked Champa along the coast repeatedly, achieving more success there. He sent diplomatic missions and tribute to the Chinese Song dynasty court, establishing trade relationships and gaining recognition. But these external adventures, while important for prestige and plunder, paled beside his domestic obsession. Suryavarman II would build a temple so vast, so perfect in its cosmic geometry, that it would eclipse every structure his predecessors had constructed. Angkor Wat was not meant to be merely a temple. It was meant to be the physical form of heaven itself, with Suryavarman as its eternal lord. The site chosen was strategic and symbolically loaded. Located south of the existing capital city of Yashodharapura, Angkor Wat sits within a moat 190 meters wide, forming a rectangle roughly 1.5 by 1.3 kilometers. The moat is not decorative. It represents the cosmic ocean surrounding Mount Meru, the sacred mountain at the center of Hindu cosmology. The temple inside rises through 3 levels, each level a platform surrounded by galleries, climbing toward a central tower that reaches 65 meters high. The 5 towers clustered at the summit replicate Mount Meru's 5 peaks. Every measurement encodes meaning. The temple's east-west axis measures 1,025 meters, and the north-south axis 800 meters. Scholars have found these dimensions correlate with astronomical cycles and units from Hindu texts describing cosmic time. But here's what makes Angkor Wat radical. It faces west. Every major temple before it faced east toward the rising sun, toward life and creation. West is the direction of death, of Vishnu's setting sun, of endings rather than beginnings. This orientation has sparked decades of scholarly debate. Some argue Suryavarman II intended Angkor Wat as his funerary temple. a place where his remains would rest and his spirit would journey to the afterlife. Others point to astronomical alignments, noting that during the spring equinox, the sun rises directly above the central tower when viewed from the western entrance. Still others suggest the western orientation reflects Angkor Wat's dedication to Vishnu, sometimes associated with the western direction in certain Hindu traditions. The truth may combine all these factors, but the deviation from tradition signals something important. Suryavarman saw himself as exceptional, worthy of breaking architectural conventions. The logistics boggle even modern engineers. Conservative estimates suggest 5 to 10 million sandstone blocks were quarried, transported, shaped, and placed. Each block weighs between 500 and 1,500 kilograms. The sandstone came from Phnom Kulen, located 40 kilometers northeast of Angkor. Workers quarried the stone during the dry season, then waited for monsoon rains to raise water levels in rivers and canals. They loaded blocks onto rafts and floated them downstream using the hydraulic network, not just for irrigation, but as a transportation infrastructure. Teams then dragged blocks from the waterways to the construction site using wooden rollers and elephants. The construction timeline remains debated. Some scholars argue the main structure was completed within Suryavarman's 37-year reign. Others suggest work continued after his death, with later kings finishing details. Either way, the project required several thousand laborers, working year-round for decades. These were not slaves in the classical Western sense. Inscriptions describe temple workers receiving rice payments from temple estates. Other texts mention rotating labor obligations, with villages across the empire required to send workers for fixed periods, similar to corvée labor systems common in pre-modern societies. Still, the human cost was real. Injuries must have been common. Deaths from accidents, exhaustion, and disease likely numbered in the hundreds at minimum. The construction techniques reveal sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The foundation sits on sand, not bedrock, which could have caused catastrophic settling. The architects drove wooden piles into the ground to create a stable platform, then laid the first course of stones. The entire structure rises without mortar. Each sandstone block was precision cut to fit its neighbors, creating joints so tight that in many places you cannot insert a knife blade between them. The galleries and towers distribute weight carefully through a system of corbelled arches, where each layer projects slightly beyond the one below until meeting at the top. This technique has limitations compared to true arches, but requires no centering or scaffolding during construction. The bas reliefs covering Angkor Wat's galleries stretch for more than 600 meters in total. They depict scenes from Hindu epics, the Ramayana's story of Rama rescuing Sita from the demon king Ravana, the Mahabharata's great war between cousins, and most famously, the churning of the ocean of milk, where gods and demons work together to churn the cosmic ocean and extract the elixir of immortality. These reliefs served multiple purposes. They educated the population in Hindu cosmology, reinforcing the religious framework that legitimized the king's divine status. For people who could not read Sanskrit inscriptions, the stone pictures told the essential stories. But the reliefs also function as propaganda. The southern gallery features a depiction of Suryavarman II himself, shown larger than his subjects, seated on a throne borne by attendants, reviewing his army as it marches past. The soldiers carry spears and shields. War elephants tower above infantry. Court officials and priests attend the king. The message is clear. Suryavarman commands heaven's favor and earthly power. His image is literally carved into the cosmic narrative. You cannot separate the king from Vishnu. You cannot question his authority without questioning the gods themselves. The stone speaks with permanent voice, outlasting any royal edict or verbal proclamation. Yet for all its cosmic pretension, Angkor Wat succeeded because of practical engineering. The moat serves triple duty: cosmic symbolism, defensive barrier, and part of the larger hydraulic network managing water flow across the region. Water enters through channels on the north side and exits on the south, helping regulate water levels and prevent stagnation. The temple's elaborate drainage system channels rainwater through carved spouts shaped like nagas, ensuring monsoon rains don't pool on the terraces and erode the foundation. Even the decorative elements serve structural purposes. The intricate carvings reduce the weight of stone blocks while maintaining their strength. When you stand before Angkor Wat today, you see religion and art. What you don't see is the mathematical precision, the hydrological planning, the bureaucratic organization required to manifest a god king's vision in sandstone. Suryavarman II built heaven, but heaven, it turns out, requires excellent drainage. It also requires an empire at the peak of its power, capable of mobilizing resources on an unprecedented scale. Angkor Wat represents that peak. Within a century, the empire would face challenges that would test whether any amount of stone could preserve divine kingship when the rains began to fail. The hydraulic metropolis, the machine beneath the jungle. The temples are what survive. They dominate photographs, fill guidebooks, attract millions of visitors annually. But the temples were never the city. They were the stone hearts of a sprawling organism built mostly from materials that rot: wood, thatch, bamboo, palm fronds. For more than a century after French explorers documented Angkor's temples in the 1860s, scholars knew the city was large but struggled to grasp its true extent. Ground surveys could only map what was visible. Dense jungle vegetation concealed everything else. Then came LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology, which uses lasers to map ground surfaces beneath vegetation. In 2012 and 2015, researchers flew over the Angkor region with LiDAR equipment mounted in aircraft. What they found rewrote our understanding completely. The scans revealed a low-density urban landscape covering more than 1,000 square kilometers, making Angkor one of the largest pre-industrial cities ever built. The LiDAR images showed geometric patterns invisible from ground level: neighborhood grids, street systems, thousands upon thousands of small ponds surrounding individual homes. These weren't random settlements that accumulated organically over time. The entire urban area followed a planned layout, organized around major temples but extending far beyond them in all directions. Angkor wasn't a city in the medieval European sense, with dense buildings pressed together inside defensive walls. It was a dispersed metropolis, more like modern Los Angeles than ancient Rome, with houses and gardens spread across a vast area connected by canals and roads. Population estimates vary, but most scholars now believe at least 750,000 people lived in the greater Angkor region at its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries. Some estimates push closer to 1 million. Either number makes it one of the most populous urban areas in the medieval world, rivaling contemporaneous Baghdad, Constantinople, or Hangzhou. But unlike those cities, Angkor's population didn't crowd into dense quarters. They spread across the landscape in a pattern that reflected both agricultural necessity and social organization. Elite families lived in compounds near major temples. Commoners occupied smaller plots farther out, but still connected to the urban fabric through the hydraulic infrastructure. That infrastructure was the genius. The Khmer engineers built massive reservoirs called barrays, artificial lakes contained by earthen embankments. The West Barray, constructed in the 11th century during the reign of Suryavarman I, measures approximately 8 kilometers long by 2 kilometers wide. It holds roughly 50 million cubic meters of water. The earthen dikes containing it rise 10 meters high in places, stretch for kilometers, and represent millions of cubic meters of moved earth. Workers shaped this landscape with hand tools and baskets over multiple dry seasons. The East Barai, built earlier, is slightly smaller, but still enormous by any standard. These weren't merely for storage or prestige. They anchored a sophisticated hydraulic network that captured water from rivers flowing off the Kulin Hills, distributed it across rice fields during dry months, and drained excess during monsoons. The water management system operated with remarkable precision. Studies of canal gradients show they were engineered with slopes as subtle as 0.1%, requiring precise surveying across kilometers to ensure water flowed by gravity alone. No pumps existed. No motors powered the system. Water moved through the network because engineers calculated exact elevations and cut channels accordingly. French archaeologists in the early 20th century marveled at the skill this required, comparing it favorably to Roman aqueducts. Recent geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed that many canals had clay linings to prevent seepage, and some featured stone spillways to regulate flow between different sections. The bures fed smaller distribution canals that branched across the landscape. These canals supplied water to rice paddies in areas that would otherwise remain dry for half the year. This allowed farmers to grow 2 or even 3 rice crops annually in optimal zones, generating surplus that fed the city's enormous non-farming population and funded continuous temple construction. The economic logic was straightforward. Control water, produce surplus rice, convert surplus into labor and tribute, build monuments that reinforce your cosmic authority, use that authority to command more labor for more water projects. The cycle reinforced itself as long as the system functioned properly. But the hydraulic network did more than irrigate fields. It also managed flooding. The Tonle Sap's seasonal expansion could overwhelm low-lying areas. Canals channeled excess water away from populated zones during peak flood season. Embankments protected specific areas from inundation. The system balanced two opposing needs: capturing enough water for dry season use while preventing destructive floods during the monsoons. This required constant monitoring and adjustment. Workers had to dredge canals to prevent siltation. They had to repair embankments damaged by water pressure or erosion. They had to open and close sluice gates at appropriate times to manage water levels. The LiDAR data revealed another crucial detail: evidence of continuous modification. The hydraulic system wasn't designed and built all at once by a single visionary ruler. It grew over centuries as successive kings added reservoirs, extended canals, rerouted water flow to serve new areas or new temples. Indravarman I built the first major barai in the late 9th century. Yasovarman built the East Barai around 900. Suryavarman added the West Barai in the 11th century. Jayavarman VII would later construct additional reservoirs around Angkor Thom in the late 12th century. Each addition increased the system's capacity, but also increased its complexity. Think of it as an organism evolving without a central nervous system. Each generation of rulers inherited a functional hydraulic machine and added to it based on their immediate needs and ambitions. No one maintained a master plan spanning centuries. No one asked whether the system was becoming too complex to manage. By the 13th century, water was moving through multiple stages, serving different elevations, requiring perfect coordination to prevent catastrophic failures. A breach in one embankment could trigger cascading failures downstream. Siltation in one canal could choke water supply to entire neighborhoods. The system worked brilliantly when properly maintained. But maintenance required centralized authority, coordinated labor, and constant vigilance. The thousands of household ponds visible in the LiDAR data tell another story. These small reservoirs, typically 15 to 30 meters across, surrounded almost every dwelling in the urban area. They served multiple purposes: bathing, washing, fishing, and most importantly, storing water for the dry season. But their ubiquity suggests something about Khmer culture itself. Every family participated in water management at the household level. Children grew up understanding how water moved through the landscape, how to maintain pond embankments, and how to read the seasons. This cultural knowledge, passed down through generations, kept the larger system functional, even as it grew more complex. The archaeological evidence shows that the hydraulic infrastructure required constant labor input. Inscriptions from temple foundations mention workers assigned specifically to maintain canals and embankments. Some temples owned labor forces of hundreds or thousands of people, many of them tasked with hydraulic maintenance rather than religious duties. The God King's cosmic authority rested on a foundation of very worldly engineering and very mundane maintenance work. When that maintenance faltered, when labor couldn't be mobilized, when coordination broke down, the machine beneath the jungle would begin to fail. And when it failed, the entire basis of Khmer kingship would collapse with it. The pivot of power, Jayavarman VII's Buddhist revolution. In 1177, Cham forces from the coastal kingdom to the east sailed up the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers, penetrating deep into Khmer territory. They sacked the capital. They looted temples. They demonstrated that Angkor, for all its cosmic pretensions and massive construction projects, was vulnerable. The invasion shattered the illusion of divine protection. Where was the God King's power when foreign armies burned his capital? Where were the gods themselves? The Cham occupation didn't last long, but the psychological damage ran deep. Into this crisis stepped Jayavarman VII, already in his 50s, a prince who had been living in Champa before the invasion. He rallied Khmer forces, drove out the invaders, and in 1181 took the throne of a wounded empire. Jayavarman VII would rule for roughly 30 to 40 years, though the exact dates remain disputed, because later kings who returned to Hinduism deliberately erased many of his inscriptions. What we know comes from the monuments he built and the inscriptions that survived. What makes him unique among Khmer rulers is his conversion to Mahayana Buddhism and his decision to make Buddhism the empire's primary religion. Previous kings had been devotees of Shiva or Vishnu, building Hindu temples and deriving legitimacy from Hindu cosmology. Jayavarman VII built Buddhist temples, portrayed himself as a bodhisattva, and reframed the basis of royal authority entirely. Mahayana Buddhism differs from the earlier Theravada tradition. It emphasizes the bodhisattva ideal, enlightened beings who delay their own entry into nirvana to help all sentient beings achieve liberation from suffering. Jayavarman VII embraced this ideology completely. His inscriptions describe him as suffering alongside his subjects, taking on their pain, working to alleviate their hardships. This represented a dramatic shift in how kingship was understood. The Hindu god kings had been remote cosmic figures whose temples reached toward heaven. Jayavarman VII presented himself as compassionate, connected to his people's daily struggles, building not just monuments but hospitals and rest houses. The centerpiece of his building program was Angkor Thom, a new walled city surrounding the Bayon Temple. Angkor Thom enclosed an area of 9 square kilometers, making it one of the largest walled cities in the medieval world. The walls themselves stood 8 meters high, built from laterite blocks, topped with a parapet. A moat 100 meters wide surrounded the entire perimeter. 5 massive gates, each topped with 4 giant stone faces, controlled entry. These faces, serene and smiling, looking outward in all 4 cardinal directions, represent Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. Or perhaps they represent Jayavarman VII himself as bodhisattva, or perhaps both. The line between the king and the divine had not vanished, only shifted. The Bayon sits at the exact center of Angkor Thom. It is among the strangest temples ever constructed. Where Angkor Wat presents clean lines and clear geometry, the Bayon is chaotic, almost organic. 54 towers rise from the central mass, each tower carved with 4 faces, 216 faces in total. They stare outward in all directions, watching everything, seeing everything. Walking through the Bayon's galleries feels claustrophobic despite the open sky. The faces press in from every angle. Some scholars see this as representing Avalokiteshvara's all-seeing compassion. Others see surveillance, a king who watches his subjects constantly. Both interpretations may be correct. The bas-reliefs covering the Bayon's outer galleries differ dramatically from Angkor Wat's cosmic scenes. Here we see daily life. Fishermen throw nets into the Tonle Sap. Soldiers march to war against Champa. Market vendors sell goods. A woman gives birth. Cockfights entertain crowds. These reliefs document the empire at street level, capturing details that no inscription mentions. We see Chinese merchants, identifiable by their distinctive hats. We see Khmer soldiers with their characteristic hairstyles and armor. We see the tools people used, the boats they sailed, the animals they domesticated. The Bayon's reliefs are our most detailed window into how ordinary people actually lived in 12th century Angkor. But the Bayon was just the beginning. Jayavarman VII launched a construction program that dwarfed even Suryavarman Sekud's ambitions. He built or expanded more than 100 temples across the empire. He constructed hospitals in cities and towns with inscriptions describing medical care provided to travelers and the poor. He built rest houses along major roads, offering shelter to merchants and pilgrims. He repaired and extended the road network, installing stone bridges carved with nagas and gods. He doubled down on the hydraulic infrastructure, building new barrays and extending canal systems around Angkor Thom. The scale beggars belief. Some estimates suggest Jayavarman VII's building program required more stone than all previous Khmer kings combined. The labor mobilization must have been enormous. Every village across the empire would have felt the burden of demands for workers and materials. The temple estates required constant supplies of rice to feed construction workers. Quarries in Phnom Kulen worked at maximum capacity. Transport networks strained to move materials. And all of this happened while the empire was simultaneously fighting wars against Champa and defending against pressure from the Thai kingdoms emerging to the west. The question arises, why? Why did Jayavarman VII push so hard? The traditional answer emphasizes his Buddhist compassion, his genuine desire to alleviate suffering through hospitals and rest houses. But there's another possibility. The Cham invasion had exposed weakness. It had shown that divine kingship offered no protection when enemies attacked. Jayavarman VII needed to restore confidence in royal authority, demonstrate that he could protect and provide for his subjects. The massive construction program served both religious and political purposes. Every temple reinforced his legitimacy. Every hospital proved his compassion. Every bridge and rest house extended his physical presence across the empire. Yet the building program came at a cost. Inscriptions from this period show signs of strain. Some temple foundations mention incomplete quotas, workers who fled, or villages that couldn't meet their obligations. Later inscriptions from after Jayavarman VII's death describe the population as exhausted. The hydraulic system, pushed to support an even larger population and more intensive rice cultivation, required more maintenance than ever. Some scholars argue that Jayavarman VII's ambitions began to push the empire beyond sustainable limits. He was trying to solve political and military problems through construction, through visible demonstrations of power and compassion. But construction requires resources, and those resources ultimately came from the land and the peasants who worked it. Jayavarman VII died sometime between 1215 and 1220. His son and immediate successors continued his Buddhist policies, but within a few decades the empire swung back toward Hinduism. Later Hindu kings defaced Buddhist images, recarved inscriptions, and attempted to erase Jayavarman VII's legacy. They failed. The Bayon still stands, its 216 faces still watching. The hospitals and rest houses have mostly crumbled, their wooden structures long rotted, but their stone door frames and lintels remain. Jayavarman VII transformed the empire, but he may also have begun its decline. He pushed the hydraulic machine to its limits, and machines pushed beyond their limits eventually break. The question was not if, but when, and what would trigger the final failure. The global hub, Angkor's invisible trade networks. When we think of Angkor, we think of temples and rice fields, but the empire's wealth came not just from agriculture, but from its position in medieval trade networks that stretched from China to the Middle East. The Tonle Sap and Mekong River gave Angkor access to maritime trade routes. Ships from Chinese ports sailed down the coast, stopping at Khmer harbors before continuing to Java, Sumatra, and eventually to India and beyond. This connected Angkor to the global economy centuries before Europeans entered the Indian Ocean in force. The archaeological evidence of this trade is scattered but revealing. Fragments of Chinese ceramics in temple foundations, Persian glass beads in burial sites, and written accounts from Chinese diplomats describing Angkor's markets. The most detailed account comes from Zhou Daguan, a Chinese diplomat who visited Angkor in 1296 and 1297, staying for nearly a year. His memoir, The Customs of Cambodia, provides our most comprehensive description of daily life in the capital. Zhou describes bustling markets where Chinese merchants sold ceramics, silk, and metal goods. He mentions local traders offering forest products, rhinoceros horns, ivory, kingfisher feathers, beeswax, lac for lacquer, aromatic woods. He describes the port facilities along the Tonle Sap where goods were loaded and unloaded. He notes the presence of foreign communities, Chinese merchants who had settled permanently, traders from Champa and others from kingdoms across Southeast Asia. The trade worked both ways. Angkor's forests contained products highly valued in Chinese markets. Rhinoceros horn was ground into powder for traditional medicine. Ivory carved into ornaments. Kingfisher feathers decorated elaborate headdresses worn by Chinese nobility. These luxury goods commanded high prices, generating enormous profits for whoever controlled their collection and trade. The Khmer kings held monopolies on certain forest products, using trade revenue to fund temple construction and military campaigns. This helps explain how Angkor sustained such massive building programs. Agricultural surplus alone couldn't have paid for it all. Trade goods and trade taxes provided crucial additional revenue. The archaeological evidence confirms Zhou Deguan's descriptions. Excavations at Angkor's port areas have uncovered thousands of pottery sherds. Analysis reveals vessels from kilns across China, green celadon from Longquan, white porcelain from Dehua, storage jars from Guangdong. The pottery dates from the 11th through 15th centuries, showing continuous trade over multiple centuries. The quantity suggests massive import volumes. These weren't just luxury goods for the elite. Chinese ceramics were common enough that even temples used them, sometimes incorporating broken pottery into foundation deposits or using large jars to store temple treasures. But the trade wasn't only with China. Glass beads found in Khmer contexts come from as far as the Middle East and India. Chemical analysis of glass composition can identify production regions. Some beads originated in Iranian or Iraqi workshops, while others came from South Indian production centers. These beads traveled along maritime trade routes that connected the Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia. Some came directly on ships sailing from Indian ports. Others came through intermediary ports in Sumatra or the Malay Peninsula. The presence of these goods demonstrates that Angkor was part of a truly global economy, connected through multiple routes to distant markets. The question becomes, what did Angkor export besides forest products? Rice seems unlikely to have been a major export. Moving bulk grain long distances by ship before modern preservation techniques was risky and expensive. Forest products make sense but couldn't have been unlimited. Recent research suggests one answer: people. Not slaves in the classical sense, but specialized workers. Khmer craftsmen were renowned for their skill in carving, metalworking, and textile production. Some may have traveled to other kingdoms as paid specialists, bringing their expertise while sending wealth back to Angkor. Chinese texts mention Khmer craftsmen working in Chinese courts. The movement of skilled workers created additional economic ties beyond simple commodity exchange. The trade networks also moved ideas and religions. Chinese Buddhism entered Cambodia partly through merchant communities who built temples in trading ports. Indian religious traditions arrived similarly, carried by Brahmin priests traveling with merchant fleets. The cosmopolitan nature of Angkor's port cities meant constant exposure to foreign customs and beliefs. This cultural exchange enriched Khmer civilization, but also created vulnerability. When trade routes shifted, when other powers emerged to compete for maritime trade, Angkor's position weakened. The rise of the Thai kingdoms to the west created new competition. Thai ports, particularly Ayutthaya, began capturing trade that previously flowed through Khmer-controlled territory. Chinese merchants found they could sail to Thai ports without making the longer journey up the Tonle Sap to Angkor. This happened gradually over the 13th and 14th centuries, but the effect was significant. Trade revenue that had funded the God King's building programs began flowing elsewhere. Simultaneously, the Mongol conquest of China disrupted traditional trade patterns. The Mongol Yuan dynasty had different priorities and preferences than the Song dynasty that preceded it. Some trade routes atrophied while others expanded, and Angkor found itself increasingly marginalized. We can see evidence of this economic shift in the archaeological record. The volume of Chinese ceramics found in 14th and 15th century deposits drops significantly compared to earlier periods. This doesn't mean trade stopped entirely, but it contracted. The temples built during this period are smaller, less elaborate, sometimes left incomplete. The inscriptions become fewer and less detailed. Economic stress was mounting even before climate changes delivered the final blow. Angkor's position as a critical trade hub was eroding, undermining the material foundation that supported the God King's cosmic pretensions. The relationship between trade and empire remains debated. Some scholars argue trade was always secondary to agriculture, that Angkor's true power came from rice, not commerce. Others point to the forest products and trade taxes as essential revenue sources that made the empire's elaborate construction projects possible. The truth probably lies between these positions. Angkor needed both agricultural surplus and trade revenue to function as it did. When trade declined and agricultural production later faltered due to climate change, the combination proved fatal. The global hub became a backwater, and the God Kings lost both the wealth and the cosmic authority to maintain their hydraulic machine. The cracks in the foundation, signs of stress. For centuries, each Khmer king built bigger and more elaborate temples than his predecessors. Each generation extended the hydraulic system, adding reservoirs and canals. The empire appeared to grow stronger with every building project. But by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, subtle signs began appearing that the system was straining. These signs are easy to miss if you're not looking carefully. They appear in incomplete temples, in modifications to existing structures, in inscriptions that mention repairs rather than new construction. The empire wasn't collapsing, not yet, but the foundation was developing cracks. Taprom Kel stands as one example. This small temple near Angkor Thom was started but never finished. The foundation is there, some walls are partially built, but the upper structure was abandoned mid-construction. Why? Temples didn't get abandoned during prosperous times. They were completed as demonstrations of the king's power and piety. An incomplete temple suggested insufficient resources or labor, or perhaps a king who died before finishing his projects and successors who couldn't or wouldn't complete them. Taprom Kel isn't unique. Several temples from the late Angkorian period show signs of hasty construction, simplified designs compared to earlier monuments, or incomplete finishing work. The hydraulic system shows even clearer evidence of stress. Engineers have studied the embankments containing the major barrays and found layers of repairs. These repairs use different materials and construction techniques than the original embankments, indicating they were added later to shore up weaknesses. The West Barai's southern dike shows multiple repair episodes, with additional layers of earth added to prevent breaches. This makes sense. Earthen dikes slowly erode under water pressure. They need regular maintenance. But the repairs become more frequent and more extensive in the 14th century, suggesting the dikes were failing faster than maintenance could keep up. Siltation became a critical problem. Rivers flowing off the Kulin Hills carried sediment. During monsoon floods, this sediment entered the canal system. Over time, it accumulated, reducing channel capacity and slowing water flow. Keeping canals clear required constant dredging. Workers had to physically remove accumulated silt, pile it on the banks, and carry it away. For a few canals, this was manageable. For hundreds of kilometers of canals, it required massive, coordinated labor. Inscriptions from the 14th century increasingly mention canal maintenance and dredging work, suggesting this was becoming a major preoccupation. Recent geoarchaeological studies have analyzed sediment cores from the barais and canals. The sediment layers tell a story. In the earlier centuries, siltation rates were moderate and regular, indicating steady maintenance. In the 14th century, the siltation rates increased dramatically. Either the watershed was producing more sediment, possibly due to deforestation, or maintenance was falling behind, probably both. The Khmer had been cutting trees in the Kulin Hills for centuries, using wood for construction and opening land for agriculture. Deforestation increases erosion. More soil washes into rivers during rains. That soil enters the hydraulic system, choking it faster than before. The population itself may have contributed to system stress. Success breeds its own problems. As Angkor's hydraulic system allowed population growth, that larger population required more food, which required more intensive agriculture, which required more water management. The system had to work harder just to maintain the status quo. Any disruption, any period when maintenance faltered, would have cascading effects. A silted canal means less water reaching certain fields. Less water means smaller harvests. Smaller harvests mean less surplus rice to pay workers. Fewer workers mean less maintenance. The cycle could spiral downward if disrupted sufficiently. Inscriptions from the 14th century show other signs of stress. The tone changes. Earlier inscriptions confidently proclaim the king's glory and the magnificence of his works. Later inscriptions sound defensive, emphasizing the king's efforts to maintain order and repair damage. Some inscriptions mention disputes over water rights, villages arguing over which fields should receive water during droughts. These disputes suggest the system was no longer producing enough surplus to satisfy everyone. When abundance decreases, competition increases. The labor force itself showed signs of strain. Zhou Daguan's account from 1296 mentions that workers were difficult to recruit for building projects. He describes people fleeing to avoid labor obligations. This is striking because it's the opposite of earlier periods when inscriptions describe workers willingly serving the temples. Something had changed. The burden had become too heavy. People were voting with their feet, leaving areas where labor demands were too intense, seeking situations where they could keep more of their harvest. Some scholars argue that Jayavarman VII's massive building program in the late 12th century began the process of overextension. His construction projects required unprecedented labor mobilization. The population may never have fully recovered from that burst of activity. His immediate successors built less, possibly because they couldn't mobilize the same resources. Then came climate changes that would transform manageable stress into catastrophic failure. But even before the droughts arrived, the system was showing weakness. Warfare added to the problems. The Thai kingdoms to the west were expanding, pressing against Angkor's borders. Military campaigns required resources, soldiers taken from farming, food supplies for armies, elephants requisitioned from villagers. The Khmer had always fought wars, but they were now fighting more of them and winning less often. Thai forces attacked and briefly captured Angkor in 1431, a humiliation that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. The God King's aura of invincibility was cracking along with his hydraulic infrastructure. None of these problems alone would have ended the empire. Complex societies are resilient. They can absorb shocks and adapt. But resilience has limits. When multiple stresses accumulate simultaneously, hydraulic maintenance falling behind, deforestation, increasing erosion, labor force declining, military pressure mounting, and then climate delivering a devastating blow, the system can reach a breaking point. Angkor was approaching that point in the early 14th century. The question was not whether crisis would come, but what form it would take and whether the empire could survive it. The answer would come from the sky, in the form of rain that didn't fall when needed and fell too hard when it finally arrived. The perfect drought, climate's finishing blow. Climate doesn't usually leave archaeological evidence. It's invisible, leaving no ruins or inscriptions, but it shapes everything. For centuries, the Khmer Empire thrived because its hydraulic system managed the monsoon cycle brilliantly. The system was designed for normal variability, wet years and dry years, strong monsoons and weak ones. What it wasn't designed for was prolonged extreme deviation from the average, and that's exactly what happened in the 14th and 15th centuries. The evidence comes from multiple scientific sources, none of them from Cambodia directly, but all pointing to the same conclusion. Tree ring data from Vietnam and Thailand shows patterns of growth and stress that correlate with rainfall. During good years, trees grow faster, laying down wider rings. During droughts, growth slows and rings narrow. The tree ring record from this region reveals several severe drought episodes. The worst occurred in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Some drought periods lasted multiple decades, not just a single bad year, but string after string of insufficient rainfall. Coral cores from the South China Sea provide another data source. Corals lay down annual growth bands like tree rings. The chemical composition of these bands reflects ocean temperature and rainfall patterns. Analysis of coral cores covering the relevant period shows evidence of major El Niño events. El Niño disrupts normal monsoon patterns across Southeast Asia, typically bringing drought conditions. The coral data indicates a period of frequent, strong El Niño events during the late 14th century, matching the tree ring evidence. Lake sediment cores from across Southeast Asia tell a similar story. During wet periods, more organic material and certain minerals wash into lakes from the surrounding watershed. During droughts, sedimentation slows and composition changes. Cores from Tonle Sap Lake itself aren't available for this period, but cores from nearby regions show distinct layers indicating prolonged dry conditions in the late 1300s and early 1400s. Computer models of regional climate patterns help interpret this evidence. Researchers have used historical climate data and modern understanding of monsoon dynamics to simulate what these drought events would have meant for rainfall in the Angkor region. The models suggest rainfall may have dropped by 20 to 30% during the worst drought periods. This doesn't sound catastrophic until you remember how finely tuned the hydraulic system was. It was designed to capture and distribute normal monsoon rainfall. A 20 to 30% decrease means significantly less water entering the Baray system, less water available for dry season irrigation, and stress on crops during critical growing periods. But drought alone wasn't the problem. Climate shifts in this region came with violent swings. After years of drought would come periods of intense, destructive rainfall. Too little water followed by too much. The hydraulic system could handle normal flooding. It channeled excess water safely away from populated areas. But extreme floods, water arriving with unusual intensity after years of drought, could overwhelm the infrastructure. Embankments weakened by years of low water levels and deferred maintenance could fail catastrophically when hit by massive floods. Physical evidence of flooding appears in the archaeological record. Sediment layers in some canals show evidence of sudden violent water flows that scoured channels and deposited thick layers of sand and debris. These deposits date to the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Some embankments show signs of catastrophic failure, breaches where water punched through, eroding entire sections down to the foundation. These weren't gradually eroded away over decades. They failed suddenly during extreme flood events. The impact on agriculture would have been devastating. Rice cultivation requires predictable water levels during the growing season. Too little water, and the plants wither. Too much at the wrong time, and they drown or wash away. The Khmer system was built to provide that predictability, smoothing out the monsoon's natural variability. But when the variability exceeded the system's capacity to manage it, crops failed. One bad year could be survived by drawing on stored grain. 2 or 3 bad years depleted reserves. A decade of intermittent drought, punctuated by destructive floods, would cause widespread hunger and economic collapse. The tree ring data shows the droughts weren't continuous, but came in pulses. There might be 5 years of severe drought, then 2 normal years, then 3 more years of drought. This pattern is almost worse than one long, continuous drought because it offers false hope. People might rebuild and replant during the good years, only to have their efforts destroyed when drought returned. Each cycle would deplete resources further. Each cycle would make recovery harder. The timing matters. These climatic disruptions hit Angkor when the system was already showing stress. Had they occurred during the empire's peak in the 12th century, when labor was abundant and the hydraulic infrastructure well maintained, Angkor might have weathered them. But hitting in the late 14th century, when maintenance was already falling behind, when labor was harder to mobilize, when warfare was draining resources, the climate shocks pushed the system past its breaking point. We should be careful not to overstate climate's role. Climate change didn't destroy Angkor directly. It didn't blast the temples or empty the city overnight. What it did was undermine the fundamental basis of the God-King's authority. That authority rested on the claim that the king mediated between heaven and earth, ensuring cosmic order manifested as earthly prosperity. When the rains failed year after year, when the carefully engineered hydraulic system couldn't deliver water to the fields, when the harvests withered and people went hungry, the God-King's claim to cosmic authority became hollow. If you can't even make it rain, what kind of God-King are you? The inscriptions stop in the early 15th century. The last dated inscription at Angkor is from 1327, though some temple building continued into the 1400s. But the silence is telling. No one was recording royal achievements anymore. No one was proclaiming the God-King's glory. Either the kings had lost the resources to commission inscriptions, or they no longer saw the point. When the basis of your authority has crumbled, proclaiming your greatness in stone rings hollow. The drought didn't end the empire by directly starving everyone. It ended the empire by destroying the ideological system that made centralized authority possible and necessary. Once that system collapsed, the city had no reason to exist, and the people had every reason to leave. The slow unraveling why they didn't just come back. Here's what didn't happen. The population didn't vanish overnight. No plague swept through and emptied the city. No foreign army enslaved everyone. The temples weren't buried by a volcanic eruption or destroyed by an earthquake. When we say 1 million people vanished, we're using dramatic language for a process that unfolded gradually over decades. The more interesting question isn't why people left, but why they never came back and why they left the way they did. The archaeological evidence shows a pattern of gradual deurbanization beginning in the late 14th century and continuing into the 15th. The elite left first. We know this because the temples stopped receiving the elaborate maintenance and donations that inscriptions from earlier periods describe in detail. Temple estates that once employed hundreds of people to maintain buildings, perform ceremonies, and manage agricultural lands were abandoned or drastically reduced in scale. The priestly class, supported by these estates, either left for new opportunities or adapted to humbler circumstances. Zhou Daguan's account from 1296 describes a vibrant urban center with markets, festivals, and elaborate court ceremonies. By the time Portuguese and European travelers arrived in the 16th century, they found Angkor largely abandoned, with only a few Buddhist monks maintaining Angkor Wat itself. Something dramatic happened in that 200-year gap. The city didn't just shrink, it transformed from a major capital into a minor religious site. The elite moved to new capitals along the Mekong River and its tributaries. Phnom Penh and other riverine locations offered advantages that Angkor no longer provided. These sites had direct access to maritime trade routes without requiring the long journey up the Tonle Sap. As trade patterns shifted and Thai kingdoms captured more of the maritime commerce, proximity to ports became more important than proximity to elaborate hydraulic infrastructure. A merchant-friendly capital on a major river made more economic sense than a temple city in the interior. The common people made different calculations. Maintaining the hydraulic system required massive coordinated labor. That labor made sense when the system delivered reliable irrigation, multiple rice harvests, and economic prosperity. And when the system began failing due to climate stress, siltation, and inadequate maintenance, the cost-benefit ratio flipped. Why work to maintain canals that don't deliver water? Why pay taxes and labor obligations to support a god king who can't make the rains come? Village-based rice farming offered a resilient alternative. Small communities could cultivate rice using rainwater and local ponds without elaborate infrastructure. Yields per hectare might be lower, but they required less labor input and no complicated maintenance. During climate instability, decentralized agriculture was actually more resilient than the centralized system. If one village's harvest failed, others might succeed. With the centralized system, a failure in the hydraulic network could affect huge areas simultaneously. This pattern of deurbanization appears in other pre-modern cities that collapsed. Teotihuacan in Mexico, Great Zimbabwe in Africa, and various Mesopotamian cities all show similar processes. Urban life requires infrastructure and specialization. Farmers produce surplus food. Craftsmen make goods. Priests perform ceremonies. Officials coordinate everything. This only works when the infrastructure functions and when coordination provides benefits exceeding its costs. When infrastructure fails and coordination breaks down, people revert to simpler, more direct modes of production. For Angkor specifically, the ideological foundation collapsed along with the infrastructure. The God King's authority was never simply military or administrative. It was cosmic. The king maintained universal order through rituals and construction projects. In return, the gods ensured prosperity and protection. When prosperity vanished and protection failed, the entire system lost legitimacy. Why follow a god king who can't fulfill his cosmic responsibilities? Buddhism may have played a role in the transition. Jayavarman VII had made Mahayana Buddhism the state religion, but after his death, subsequent kings returned to Hinduism. Later still, Theravada Buddhism from Sri Lanka and Mon regions began spreading through Cambodia. Theravada Buddhism is less hierarchical than Mahayana, requiring less elaborate temple complexes and supporting a simpler monastic lifestyle. It also places less emphasis on god kings and more on individual spiritual practice. As Theravada spread, it provided an alternative ideological framework that didn't require massive temple mountains or hydraulic engineering to demonstrate cosmic authority. The shift to new capitals wasn't a retreat or an admission of defeat. It was adaptation. Cambodian kingdoms continued to exist for centuries after Angkor's abandonment. They fought wars, conducted trade, built temples, and maintained sophisticated courts. They just did it elsewhere, in locations better suited to new economic and political realities. The riverine capitals gave better access to maritime trade. They required less elaborate infrastructure. They were easier to defend against Thai military pressure. What about the people who stayed? Archaeological surveys show that people continued living in the Angkor region, just not in urban concentrations. Villages persisted. Rice continued to be cultivated, but the population dispersed across the landscape rather than concentrating around major temples. This makes sense. The land itself remained fertile. The Tonle Sap still flooded annually. Rice still grew. What disappeared was the centralized authority that organized mass labor for infrastructure projects. Life continued, just organized differently. The temples remained standing because they were stone. Everything else rotted. The wooden houses, the thatched roofs, the bamboo markets, the palm leaf manuscripts, all of it decomposed within years or decades of abandonment. This is why European explorers in the 19th century found temples emerging from jungle but no visible city. The city was there. It just wasn't stone. Only the religious cores survived, and even those were steadily being dismantled by vegetation. The question, why didn't they come back, assumes coming back would have been desirable. But why would they? The hydraulic system would have required massive investment to repair. The political and economic conditions that made Angkor advantageous no longer existed. The riverine capitals were working well. The ideological system that centered kingship on temple mountains and water management had been replaced. There was no going back because there was nothing to go back to except empty stone buildings in the jungle. The empire didn't fail. It transformed, adapted, and moved on. The temples stood as monuments to a system that had outlived its usefulness. The jungle's embrace, rediscovery, and the modern myth. The jungle reclaimed Angkor with astonishing speed. Trees that would take a century to grow in temperate climates reach maturity in decades in tropical Southeast Asia. Within a generation of abandonment, roots would have penetrated the temple foundations. Within a century, massive trees would have grown through courtyards and galleries. The famous images of Ta Prohm with enormous tree roots cascading over stone walls show what happens when tropical vegetation encounters undefended architecture. The roots don't simply cover the stones, they penetrate every crack, expand as they grow, and physically pry apart the masonry. This rapid reclamation served a purpose. It preserved the stone cores while erasing the wooden city around them. If Angkor had remained in open grassland, the stones would have been quarried for building materials elsewhere. Local populations would have dismantled the temples piece by piece, repurposing the carved blocks for new construction. This happened to many ancient sites, but jungle-covered temples are difficult to quarry. The vegetation protects them by making them harder to access and work. So ironically, the same jungle that makes Angkor appear romantically lost is the reason enough remains for us to study. The Khmer people never forgot Angkor. It remained a pilgrimage site, particularly Angkor Wat, which housed Buddhist monks continuously through the centuries. Cambodian legends and chronicles mention the great temples, but the site's significance diminished in the Cambodian consciousness because the capital had moved. Angkor was like a former capital city anywhere else, historically important, but no longer relevant to current politics. The temples were old buildings, not actively maintained royal centers. European discovery of Angkor is a misnomer that reflects colonial attitudes. French explorer Henri Mouhot visited in 1860 and published detailed descriptions that captivated European audiences. His accounts presented Angkor as a lost civilization, a mysterious city swallowed by jungle unknown to the current inhabitants. This narrative was false. Mouhot's Cambodian guides led him there. The monks living at Angkor Wat showed him around. The local population knew exactly where the temples were. What was new was European awareness, not the temples themselves. But the lost city narrative proved irresistible. It fit perfectly with 19th century European assumptions about civilization and barbarism. Here was evidence of a great civilization, clearly advanced given the architecture, that had somehow fallen and been forgotten by its own descendants. European scholars of the time struggled to explain it. Some attributed the temples to ancient Romans or Greeks. Others suggested Indian colonizers built them, and the Khmer had nothing to do with it. These theories reflected racist assumptions about who could build monumental architecture. French colonial authorities established the École Française d'Extrême Orient in 1900, and it took responsibility for studying and preserving Angkor. Early French archaeologists did crucial work documenting the temples, mapping the site, and beginning excavations. They also began clearing vegetation, removing the trees that were dismantling the structures. This work was necessary to preserve the monuments, but it also created the sanitized ruins we see today. Modern visitors encounter cleared, manicured temples that look ancient, but not actively decaying. The jungle is kept at bay by constant maintenance. The process of reconstruction began in the 1920s using a technique called anastylosis, developed at Borobudur in Indonesia. This involves carefully dismantling unstable structures, making necessary repairs to foundations and individual stones, and reassembling everything in its original configuration. This is slow, expensive work. A single temple might require years of effort, but it's effective. Many temples that would have completely collapsed have been stabilized and made accessible to visitors. Modern technology continues revealing Angkor's secrets. The LiDAR surveys mentioned earlier transformed our understanding of the city's extent and organization. Ground-penetrating radar helps archaeologists locate buried structures without excavating. Chemical analysis of pottery and glass traces trade networks. Stable isotope analysis of human remains reveals information about diet and migration. Each new technique adds detail to our picture of how Angkor functioned. The modern myth of Angkor often emphasizes mystery, a civilization that appeared from nowhere, built wonders, and vanished inexplicably. This narrative sells books and attracts tourists, but it's not accurate. The Khmer Empire emerged gradually from earlier states, building on centuries of accumulated knowledge. Its achievements in hydraulic engineering and architecture were impressive but explicable through human ingenuity and effort. Its decline resulted from multiple intersecting factors, not a single catastrophic event. Current climate discourse often points to Angkor as a warning, a sophisticated civilization brought down by environmental change that stressed its infrastructure beyond its capacity to adapt. This framing contains truth, but shouldn't be oversimplified. The Khmer people didn't go extinct. They adapted, moved, and built new kingdoms. The empire's end was traumatic for those who lived through it, but it wasn't the end of Cambodian civilization. Angkor today faces different threats. Tourism brings needed revenue, but also wear from millions of feet on ancient stones, vibrations from tour buses, and pressure to build modern facilities near the temples. Climate change is again affecting the site, with altered rainfall patterns causing new preservation challenges. The ancient hydraulic system, no longer maintained, doesn't protect the temples from flooding. Tree roots that were cleared decades ago are growing back because constant maintenance is expensive and difficult. The site's meaning continues to evolve. For Cambodians, Angkor represents national pride and historical continuity. The temple complex appears on the national flag. Schools teach Angkorian history as a golden age. For scholars, it's a laboratory for studying pre-modern urbanism, hydraulic engineering, and social complexity. Global community, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a testament to human achievement that transcends national boundaries. The lesson Angkor offers isn't about mystery or inevitable collapse. It's about limits. The Khmer Empire built brilliantly within the constraints of their environment and technology. Their hydraulic system was a masterpiece of pre-modern engineering. But every system has limits. When environmental conditions shifted beyond what the system could handle, and when political and economic factors prevented adequate response, the system failed. The people adapted and survived. The empire did not. We face similar challenges today with our own complex systems, global supply chains, interconnected financial networks, infrastructure dependent on stable climate conditions. Like the Khmer, we've built sophisticated systems that work brilliantly under normal conditions. The question is whether we can maintain them when conditions shift, whether we can adapt fast enough when multiple stresses accumulate. Angkor's temples stand as monuments not to mysterious collapse, but to the eternal tension between human ambition and environmental reality. They remind us that even the most impressive achievements require constant maintenance, adaptation, and humility about the limits of control. The jungle waits patiently. It always does.